Hey, church family, welcome back to another Focus Friday. I want to pick up right where I left off last Friday, talking about this connection point between eyes and gratitude. So, we talked about this concept of the singleness of eye, meaning to set your attention on God, and the singleness of heart, setting your life according to God's will. And when we do that, when we walk in a singleness of eye and a singleness of heart, we can have gratitude. And that's what God's desire is for our lives, not just this week because we just celebrated Thanksgiving, but every week of our lives. Interestingly enough, when I looked up this idea of single vision, and then I looked up the idea of double vision, there's this condition called diplopia, which actually talks about double vision. And it's when it occurs when two eyes are actually not looking at the same thing. So one of the first things that I kind of think of is to look cross-eyed, but it's actually talking about one eye looking at one object and another eye looking at something else. So what results is a single object appearing twice in your vision. This is what diplopia is. And so when we're talking about spiritual vision or having this idea of spiritual insight or revelation, instead of having our whole attention, our whole focus on God, which leads to gratitude, it means that we are divided, having two objects in our view. We're divided between God and something else, which usually leads to frustration. And this is what results in spiritual double vision. And God doesn't want us to have that. God wants us to, again, to have singleness of heart, singleness of eye, so that we can actually walk in gratitude in our lives. What did Jesus come to do? One of the first things that he said, actually his first sermon, that's covered in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and a little bit into 19, he references this one phrase that I want to just reference here today, and it's the recovery of sight to the blind. And when we see that, we obviously think of those that are naturally blind. We can think of those that are spiritually blind and don't see their need for Christ. But this word recovery means a restoration of light or a restoration of sight. And the second definition means a looking up. Doesn't that speak to, again, our attitude? When we look up to God, our attitude will follow, and out of that will come a gratitude from our lives and thankfulness and just thanksgiving, which is obviously something we've experienced this past weekend, which God wants us to carry on in our lives. Paul went on to explain that the church actually has this role that Jesus talked about in Luke 4:18, describing himself, but Paul described it from the context that it's the church's role as well. Acts chapter 26, verses 17 and 18, he said this: "Open the eyes of the outsiders so they can see the difference between dark and light, and choose light, to see the difference between Satan and God, and choose God." So the church is called to restore light in order to restore sight. That's what God is after, so that we can discern for ourselves what is of God and what is of the enemy, so that we can then help others to discern what is of God and what is of the enemy. When we focus on what is of God and our heart's desires to please him, gratitude follows. When we're conflicted by that and our heart is tracking with more of the enemy's thoughts and perspective, that's where we get double vision and we start to get to a place of frustration. God wants us to have healthy eyes that leads to gratitude, not diseased or unhealthy eyes that leads to frustration. Listen, the state of our eyes ultimately determines what we allow in. The state of our hearts actually determines how we perceive what we allow in. And this is important because our spiritual perception determines our spiritual attitude. I'm going to say that again. It's important. Our spiritual perception determines our spiritual attitude. And this is ultimately when we see that and we align our hearts to the singleness of heart, singleness of eyes, we will have gratitude. So let's take good care of what we see and what we allow in, because it'll have a major effect on how we live our lives. Bless you, church. Have an awesome night.